Good afternoon from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of SpaceflightNow.com, and welcome to our live coverage for another SpaceX launch here on Florida's Space Coast. The Starlink 6-1 mission is scheduled for liftoff at 6:13 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 11:13 p.m. UTC. As you can see the clock counting on the upper right, that's an hour and 13 minutes away. This mission will be carrying the first in a new generation of Starlink satellites to orbit. There are 21 of these heavier upgraded Starlink spacecraft buttoned up for launch inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 out on Space Launch Complex 40. The launch time has been delayed this afternoon. We put out a message earlier on Twitter as well as on our website updating the target launch time. SpaceX rescheduled the launch from the original target time of 1:38 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, again, it's targeted for 6:13 p.m. The reason was there's a solar storm that's affecting the Earth right now, bringing radiation and charged particles into Earth's magnetosphere. And there's concern that those particles and that radiation could affect the performance of computer systems on the Falcon 9 and the Starlink satellites during the launch sequence this afternoon. SpaceX expects the space weather conditions that are in question to improve this afternoon, but we haven't heard an update since the earlier message from SpaceX today to announce the delay. That's about a 4.5-hour delay from the original target launch time. But right now, we're not aware of any other issues that would affect the launch, which is set again for 6:13 p.m. Eastern Time, 23:13 UTC. Here's a close-up look at the Falcon 9 out on Pad 40. It was rolled out to the pad over the weekend and raised vertical yesterday in preparation for this launch. At that time yesterday, SpaceX was planning as many as 3 Falcon 9 launches today. 2 of those have already been delayed, the first of which was scrubbed very early this morning. That was the launch of the scheduled launch of NASA's Crew 6 mission to the International Space Station, carrying a crew of 4 astronauts up to the ISS. That launch was scrubbed at T-minus 2 minutes due to an issue with the engine ignition system out at Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center, a few miles to the north of Pad 40, which you're looking at now. That human spaceflight mission, that launch, has been delayed now until no earlier than Thursday morning at 12:34 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:34 UTC. The other launch that was supposed to happen today was out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with another batch of Starlink satellites. That was scheduled for this afternoon or late morning California time and has now been delayed until no earlier than tomorrow due to bad weather. But SpaceX still has a shot to launch one of those 3 missions that were originally scheduled for today. This one, Starlink 6-1 from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. Weather conditions here locally are ideal for launch. It is a bit breezy, but the wind measurements that we've seen this afternoon are under the Falcon 9's launch limit. You can see the camera shaking a bit in the breezy conditions, but skies are clear. And the weather forecast going into the countdown called for a low risk of upper-level wind constraints being a concern today. We haven't heard any news on that front. But all weather conditions, at least terrestrially, shaping up for a good launch day here in Florida. We're standing by for that update on space weather. The SpaceX team will get a briefing from the launch weather officer in the next 30 minutes or so, and that will feed into the decision whether to proceed into propellant loading of the Falcon 9 rocket. That is set to begin at T-minus 35 minutes. If you're just joining us and haven't done so yet, will you please ask you to hit the thumbs up or the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. So again, if you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. Now, T-minus 1 hour and counting, you're continuing to watch live views of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Out at Pad 40, the Falcon 9 rocket is vertical in preparation for a launch attempt this evening at 6:13 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, that's 1 hour away, 2313 UTC for those of you in other time zones around the world. This mission will be carrying the first batch of new generation Starlink satellites. They're known as Starlink V2 Mini. There are 21 of these spacecraft on board. These are significantly fewer number of these satellites on this mission as SpaceX typically launches on a Starlink flight. We typically see 50 to 60 Starlink satellites on each mission, depending on which orbit the mission is going to. This V2 Mini design is an upgraded, more capable, heavier variant of the Starlink satellite bus built by SpaceX's Starlink Satellite Development Facility in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. These satellites weigh about 800 kilograms apiece. That's about 1,760 pounds, nearly 3 times heavier than the previous generation of Starlink satellites known as Starlink version 1.5, which we've been seeing launch over the last couple of years. This stack of Starlink satellites is held down onto the rocket with retention rods, a similar stack setup, flat-packed setup as we've seen on previous Starlink satellite missions. But the difference is these satellites are much bigger. They're about 4.4 times the surface area of the previous generation of Starlink satellites. Once they're deployed off the top of the Falcon 9, they'll unfurl solar panels to a span of about 100 feet or 30 meters. And another innovation on these satellites is they used argon Hall thrusters for in-orbit maneuvers, replacing a lower thrust krypton-fueled electric plasma thruster used on earlier satellites. The Falcon 9 rocket for this launch will be aiming to release the satellites into a transfer orbit about 230 miles or 370 kilometers in altitude at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. Here's a side-by-side comparison of what the Starlink version 1.5 and the Starlink version 2 Mini configurations looked like. You can see the differences here on the left. Each layer of the Starlink 1.5 stack on the left from a previous mission actually consists of 2 satellites. On the right, the Starlink version 2 Mini, each layer is just a single satellite. The Starlink version 2 Mini is a miniature version of the second generation Starlink design that SpaceX plans to launch in the future on the company's super heavy booster and Starship rocket, which will be carrying many more of these satellites into orbit to greatly expand the capacity of the Starlink network. Each of these Starlink satellites has 4 times the capacity of the previous version 1.5 Starlink spacecraft. They introduce a new frequency band called E-band that is used for backhaul and connections to gateway stations on the Earth. They also have upgraded phased array antennas. I mentioned earlier that the argon Hall thruster replaces the krypton thruster used on the earlier generation of Starlink satellites. And these spacecraft are 2.6 times heavier and 4.4 times the surface area of the previous Starlinks. You can see here another view of these stack of Starlink satellites inside the SpaceX payload processing facility here at Cape Canaveral. Off to the left, on the lower left, is a stack of older generation Starlink 1.5 satellites awaiting launch in the future. SpaceX isn't done with launching the older generation of Starlink satellites. We know of a couple of missions for sure still to come that'll use that stack of satellites, both here in Florida and out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. The Starlink V2 Mini configuration was developed as an intermediate step between the older version 1.5 Starlink satellites and the new full-size version 2, which will launch on the Starship rocket. But the Starship rocket has encountered some development delays. It may be approaching its first test flight, its first orbital test flight in the coming weeks, however, and SpaceX is eager to get that rocket demonstrated, and will put Starlink version 2, full-size version 2 satellites on that Starship rocket in the future. I mentioned this spacecraft design features a new plasma propulsion system. It's a Hall thruster fueled by argon gas. This thruster has more than twice the thrust of the krypton-fueled thruster used on the older version 1.5 satellites. Argon gas is much cheaper to procure and to purchase than krypton. And SpaceX, with plans to launch thousands of these satellites, the fuel cost does become a factor. The argon thruster, again, has more thrust. It's also more fuel efficient than the krypton thruster that has been used on previous incarnations of Starlink satellites. So that was a quick overview of this mission. Again, this is the 74th Falcon 9 launch, primarily dedicated to launching satellites for the Starlink network. But this one is a bit noteworthy because it's launching a new Starlink design, a new Starlink spacecraft bus. And this mission, with the 21 satellites on board, will actually push SpaceX beyond the threshold of 4,000 satellites launched into the Starlink network. This includes prototypes and test vehicles no longer in service. Some of those have already been deorbited and have re-entered the atmosphere and burned up at the end of their missions. But this mission will push them beyond the 4,000 satellites total in terms of number of satellites that have been launched. Currently, about 3,600 of those are in orbit. T-minus 48 minutes, 13 seconds and counting. One of the next milestones in the countdown will be the start of propellant loading. That's set to get underway at T-minus 35 minutes, about 13 minutes from now. For those of you who keep track of precise launch times, this launch is targeted for 6:13 and 50 seconds. So 6:13:50 Eastern Standard Time. That is 23:13:50 UTC. T-minus 43 minutes, 30 seconds. Right now, the SpaceX team is expected to be electronically polled in the next few minutes for their go or no-go to begin propellant loading. That propellant loading with kerosene and liquid oxygen is set to get underway at T-minus 35 minutes, about 8 minutes from now. One of the key watch items for the SpaceX team during this poll will be the space weather conditions, as a solar storm brings radiation and charged particles into the area around the Earth, affecting the magnetosphere and some of the regions of space that the Falcon 9 will be climbing into on its mission to deploy these 21 upgraded Starlink internet satellites. Weather conditions here locally at Cape Canaveral are favorable for launch, and we're not aware of any technical issues being worked by the team for this mission. 42 minutes, 30 seconds until liftoff time. If you haven't done so yet, we'll ask you once more, please hit the thumbs up or the like button on our stream. That helps us gain a bigger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this golden hour launch to as many people as possible, and one way to help us do that is to click the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. We've seen some of the Coast Guard helicopters passing behind Pad 40, behind the Falcon 9 rocket just offshore over the last few minutes. This is a standard part of the launch countdown preparations here on Florida Space Coast, as the Coast Guard teams perform a sweep of the restricted waters just off the coast under the Falcon 9's flight corridor. It'll be heading off to the east-southeast after taking off from Pad 40 this evening. And the Coast Guard is charged, along with the U.S. Space Force, for maintaining a safe corridor both in airspace and over the water as the Falcon 9 makes its way to space. T-minus 40 minutes and counting. This mission will be the 10th launch of the year from here at Cape Canaveral and at Kennedy Space Center. You can see the climbing pace of launches over the last 2 decades here on Florida Space Coast. Last year, there were 57 orbital launch attempts from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station or Kennedy Space Center. This year, officials from the Space Force are predicting roughly 90 launches originating from here on Florida Space Coast. 9 launches already complete. Number 10 now less than 40 minutes away, assuming all conditions are go for launch. Again, SpaceX officials are reviewing the space weather conditions as a solar storm is affecting Earth and bringing radiation into the space around Earth. And that radiation could affect computer systems and electronics on the launch vehicle and on the Starlink satellites after they get to space. So officials want to make sure the conditions are favorable to prevent anything untoward happening to the spacecraft or the rocket during its ascent into orbit. We're approaching T-minus 38 minutes, which is when we would expect to hear a go or no-go from SpaceX's launch director for propellant loading and liftoff. Assuming all conditions are go, propellant loading would begin at T-minus 35 minutes with the loading of liquid oxygen and kerosene into the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket, as well as kerosene into the upper stage. Liquid oxygen loading on the upper stage will get underway at T-minus 16 minutes. And then in the final 7 minutes of the countdown, the engines on the bottom of the first stage will be chilled or thermally conditioned for launch. The strong back will retract at T-minus 4 minutes 30 seconds. And then at T-minus 2 minutes, propellant loading should be terminated. At that point, SpaceX should have a fully fueled, fully loaded Falcon 9 rocket with 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen on board. And then at T-minus 1 minute, control of the countdown will be passed from a ground control computer to the Falcon 9's onboard computer. Propellant tanks will be pressurized for flight. The engine start sequence will begin at T-minus 3 seconds, and if that sequence goes well, if all engines check out healthy, the clamps at the bottom of the rocket will be released at T0, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin rising off the pad on the Starlink 6-1 mission. Again, liftoff currently set for 6:13 p.m. Eastern Time.
For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold, hold, hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the auto sequence immediately and proceed into launch abort. At T-minus seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Launch auto sequence has started.
You're now hearing the voice of SpaceX Launch Control. So the poll that we talked about a few minutes ago has been completed, and the team polled go to proceed into propellant loading. So right now, propellant loading is beginning out at pad 40. 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen will be flowed into the two-stage vehicle over the next 30 minutes or so. So SpaceX does have some optimism to get this mission off the ground this evening, despite the concerns with the solar storm and space weather. Now, less than 35 minutes to go. The countdown is currently being controlled by a ground launch sequencer computer. This computer is an automated sequencer that oversees numerous steps to prepare and configure the Falcon 9 rocket and ground systems for flight. And at T-minus 1 minute, control of the countdown will be passed from the ground computer to the Falcon 9 rocket's onboard computer. That onboard computer will govern the final 60 seconds of the countdown. 33 minutes, 40 seconds until liftoff. T-minus 32 minutes and counting. Propellant loading is proceeding this evening here at Cape Canaveral for the launch of SpaceX's Starlink 6-1 mission on board a Falcon 9 rocket. This is one of 3 Falcon 9 missions that SpaceX had hoped to launch today, but the other 2 launches, one up at Kennedy Space Center a few miles away from this launch pad, and then one out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, were both scrubbed. The launch from Kennedy Space Center was set to carry a crew of 4 astronauts to the International Space Station, but that launch was called off just a couple of minutes before liftoff very early this morning at 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time due to a ground system issue. That crew launch has been rescheduled for no earlier than Thursday morning. The launch out at Vandenberg Space Force Base northwest of Los Angeles was supposed to go off this afternoon with its own set of Starlink satellites on board. That launch was delayed to no earlier than tomorrow due to bad weather. However, SpaceX says that the crew mission has top priority on the company's launch manifest, so that Starlink launch tomorrow could be grounded to wait for the crew launch to get off the ground on Thursday if that launch remains as scheduled. NASA requires a certain amount of time to review data from each Falcon 9 launch, and they typically want a day or two between a Falcon 9 launch and a crew mission on a Falcon 9 rocket. So that Starlink launch tomorrow may be within that window and may not be able to get off the ground due to NASA's data review requirements for their stringent oversight for human spaceflight missions. T-minus 30 minutes and counting. This mission, though, is enough separation between this mission and the crew launch on Thursday for that data review to have time to occur. So SpaceX is moving ahead with the launch attempt tonight for the Starlink 6-1 mission. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up button or the like button on YouTube. That helps us get as many people watching this launch as possible. We want to bring this exciting mission to as many folks as are interested. And one way to do that, one way to help us do that, is to click the thumbs up or the like button. We would really appreciate that support. Another way to support our coverage is to contribute in the Super Chat. If you contribute in the Super Chat, you'll be helping us maintain and expand our coverage. Again, this is one of 3 launches from both coasts of the United States that we were preparing to cover today, and that does strain our resources in some respects. So any contribution you can provide would be greatly appreciated in the Super Chat. You can also join our YouTube channel as a member. If you join, depending on which membership level you choose, you can gain access to bonus members-only video features, and again, that's another way to support our coverage. Also, another way to support, and a way that's free to you, is to click the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. If you do that, you'll get alerts when we're going live with launch coverage. T-minus 28 minutes and counting. This mission will be heading to the southeast after launching from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, heading out near the Bahamas as it heads toward an orbit inclined 43 degrees to the equator. This map shows the approximate ground track for this mission. We've labeled the locations here of Space Launch Complex 40, as well as the location of SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, out in the Atlantic Ocean northeast of the Bahamas. That's where the first stage booster will be targeting a landing about 8.5 minutes after liftoff. So the red line here shows the flight path for the first stage as it makes its ballistic suborbital arc, targeting that drone ship landing. The green line shows the path that the second stage will take. It'll take a very slight right-hand turn. It's called a dogleg maneuver by vectoring its thrust. And to do that, it'll make that right turn. And the reason for that is to avoid flying over populated areas, populated islands in the Bahamas, and it'll thread the needle between Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and the Leeward Islands, the Lesser Antilles out in the Caribbean, to ensure that the rocket does not fly over any populated areas as it's climbing into orbit. Once it is in orbit, it is safe from re-entering the atmosphere over populated areas, and there's no longer any concern about flying over land masses at that point. But for range safety reasons, this mission, as many Starlink missions do, to reach these various orbital planes and various inclinations that are in the Starlink network, they have to steer around some islands and populated areas, and tonight's mission is no different. Now back live, a full screen view of Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Propellant loading is proceeding, now 26 minutes from liftoff time. Weather conditions continue to look favorable here in Florida.
Stage 2 cryohelium dump has started.
In parallel with the loading of kerosene and liquid oxygen onto the Falcon 9, SpaceX is also loading cryogenic helium into the vehicle. This will be stored in high-pressure tanks called composite overwrapped pressure vessels on both stages of the Falcon 9. A loading of cryogenic helium into the first stage should have gotten underway a few minutes ago, and we just heard the call that cryogenic helium loading is now underway on stage 2. This helium is used to maintain pressure inside the propellant tanks of the Falcon 9 as the liquid propellant levels in those tanks decreases during flight as that propellant is consumed. Less than 25 minutes now until liftoff. T-minus 22 minutes and counting. We're a couple of minutes away from the so-called big vent that will be visible and apparent in this view of pad 40 when a stream of gaseous oxygen will appear from the strongback. That's the structure just to the right side of the Falcon 9 rocket. That big vent is associated with the preparations to load liquid oxygen on board the upper stage of the Falcon 9. That's the only propellant tank currently not being filled. The other 3 propellant tanks are being loaded at this time with kerosene and liquid oxygen. Also, in the next minute or so, we expect to hear a call from SpaceX Launch Control confirming that the upper stage fuel tank, the kerosene tank, has been fully loaded.
Pogo A. Pogo B.
And there's the big vent from the strongback. You can see that gaseous oxygen blowing in the breeze.
Strongback chill has started.
And the strongback chill down has started. We just heard that call from SpaceX Launch Control. So that's the thermal conditioning of the strongback transfer line, the liquid oxygen line that runs from the ground storage tank where that supercooled oxidizer is stored up the strongback to the level of the upper stage of the Falcon 9, and then there's a line that runs from the strongback into the Falcon 9 rocket where that propellant is then loaded into the vehicle. Those lines need to be thermally conditioned for the flow of oxidizer. Loading of liquid oxygen on stage 2 will begin in about 3 minutes or so. But this big vent is a good sign that the countdown is right on target for launch at 6:13 p.m. Eastern Time. That is 23:13 UTC.
And stage 2 fuel load is complete.
And we've heard the call that the second stage fuel load is complete. So the first of the 4 propellant tanks has been loaded. If you look closely in this view, on the first stage, about halfway up that first stage booster, you can see the line of frost that's developed as the super cold oxidizer is loaded into the vehicle. Now less than 19 minutes to go. You can see some of the news photographers and news media have gathered here at the Kennedy Space Center press site. We're about 4 miles away from the launch pad. This vent of gaseous oxygen will be terminated in the next 30 seconds or so. That's when the chill down will be complete of the liquid oxygen line that I mentioned earlier. And that's when also the liquid oxygen flow into the upper stage of the Falcon 9 will begin. And that big vent is now terminated. 16 minutes, 30 seconds until liftoff.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And we've heard the call now that second stage liquid oxygen loading is now underway. This is the last of the 4 propellant tanks to be filled this evening. Liftoff is scheduled for 6:13 and 50 seconds Eastern Time. That's 23:13:50 UTC, about 7 minutes before sunset locally here at Cape Canaveral. Again, our camera is about 4 miles away from the pad, looking off to the east where the Falcon 9 is standing at 229 feet or 70 meters in height. We showed you the trajectory map a little earlier in our coverage. Here's a look at the launch timeline. It'll take about 1 hour and 4 minutes for the Falcon 9 to make its way into orbit and release all 21 Starlink satellites. The rocket will be heading off to the southeast. It'll pass the speed of sound in about a minute. And then 2.5 minutes into the flight, plus 2 minutes 26 seconds, is when the first stage will cut its 9 Merlin main engines. After engine shutdown, a few moments later, that first stage booster will separate from the upper stage and begin its maneuvers to descend back into the atmosphere. The upper stage will light its single Merlin vacuum engine for about a 6-minute burn to place the satellites into a parking orbit. While that's going on, the first stage will extend its titanium grid fins. It'll arc to an apogee, or a high point of its ballistic trajectory, and then dip back into the atmosphere, flying tail first. It'll relight 3 of its engines for an entry burn about 6 minutes into the flight, and then relight a single engine, the center engine, about 8 minutes after liftoff. That's a final braking burn to allow the rocket to settle onto the drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas parked out in the Atlantic Ocean northeast of the Bahamas. The upper stage will continue on into orbit. It'll conduct a very brief 2-second restart about 54 minutes into the flight, and then at 64 minutes, 1 hour and 4 minutes after launch, shortly after 7:15 p.m. or 7:20 p.m. Eastern Time, that's when the 21 Starlink satellites will be deployed. Another shot of one of the Coast Guard helicopters passing near the launch complex area, conducting one of its final pre-launch surveys. 11 minutes 30 seconds from liftoff. Continuing to watch a live shot of the Falcon 9 rocket out on pad 40. The Falcon 9 stands 229 feet tall. That's 70 meters in height. The first stage of the Falcon 9 is powered by 9 Merlin main engines. Those engines burn a mix of kerosene and liquid oxygen. Those 9 engines will burn about 2.5 minutes, producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust at full throttle. Above that is the inner stage. That's the adapter between the first stage and the second stage. It actually comes back with the first stage and is reused. That's where the 4 titanium hypersonic grid fins are located to help stabilize and steer the rocket during its descent back into the atmosphere. The second stage is powered by a single Merlin vacuum engine. That engine generates more than 200,000 pounds of thrust. That's fairly powerful for an upper stage engine in the rocket business. It has an extension, a wide expansion nozzle for optimization for firing in the vacuum of space, hence the engine's name, the Merlin vacuum. Above that is the 43-foot tall or 17-meter tall payload fairing. It's about 17 feet wide, 5 meters in diameter. Those 2 payload fairing halves are reusable as well. SpaceX has a downrange recovery vessel that will retrieve those 2 fairing halves from the sea after they parachute into the Atlantic. And then inside the payload fairing, the 21 Starlink internet satellites, the Starlink version 2 mini satellites, stacked in launch configuration, one on top of the other, for liftoff at 6:13 p.m. Eastern Time, less than 10 minutes from now. T-minus 7 minutes 50 seconds. The next major step in the countdown will be the chill down or thermal conditioning of the 9 Merlin engines at the bottom of the first stage of the Falcon 9. That's due to get underway at T-minus 7 minutes. That'll be followed by final checks of the Falcon 9's guidance and navigation system. And there also will be checkouts and final testing of the autonomous flight safety system. That's the destruct system that would be activated to destroy the rocket if it flies off course or suffers a major incident after launch to avoid any threat to populated areas. T-minus 7 minutes 15 seconds. One more time, if you haven't done so, please hit the thumbs up or the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. So again, that's pretty easy to do, just a thumbs up or the like button. That we would really appreciate that help if you can do that. Now inside of 7 minutes until liftoff.
Engine chill has started.
We've heard the call that engine chill down is underway. This involves us flowing small amounts of liquid oxygen through some of the engine plumbing to condition those components for the more rapid flow of super cold oxidizer when those engines actually start up at T-minus 3 seconds. Protects that hardware against the risk of damage from thermal shock. Again, if you want to support our coverage, please consider contributing in the super chat here on YouTube. You can also support our coverage by joining our YouTube channel, becoming a member. And if you do that, you can gain access to members-only bonus video features. Your support helps us continue to cover these launches here on Florida Space Coast.
Stage 1 fuel load is complete.
T-minus 6 minutes. The first stage of the Falcon 9 is now fully loaded with its supply of RP-1 fuel. That's rocket propellant 1, a highly refined variant of kerosene. So both stages have now been fully loaded with kerosene. That's 46,000 gallons of hydrocarbons on board. Liquid oxygen will continue flowing into the vehicle until T-minus 2 minutes.
Falcon 9 tanks are pressurizing for strong back retract.
T-minus 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The next major event we expect to see will be the retraction of the strong back out at pad 40.
Strong back lower has started.
You can see the strong back here is the structure just to the right of the Falcon 9. That will be lowered to an angle of about 1.5 degrees in preparation for engine ignition. At liftoff, you'll see that strong back swing away from the rocket in a more rapid motion to clear the way for the Falcon 9 to begin its climb to space. Now inside of 4 minutes until liftoff. Everything looking good for launch at 6:13 p.m. and 50 seconds Eastern Time. That's 23:13 UTC. You can see the strong back now in motion, retracting away from the Falcon 9, 3.5 minutes until liftoff. This will be SpaceX's 13th launch of the year. It'll be the 206th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket overall, the 216th flight for SpaceX's Falcon rocket family since 2006. T-minus 3 minutes and counting.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
You heard the call that the first stage has been fully loaded with liquid oxygen. We should hear a similar call shortly for the second stage.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
T-minus 1 minute, 25 seconds.
Ground gas closeouts has started.
At T-minus 60 seconds, the control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's flight computer.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
T-minus 50 seconds. We did hear the call from launch control that the Falcon 9 is in startup. At this time, the onboard computer is controlling the countdown. Propellant tanks on board the Falcon 9 will be brought to flight pressure. Vent valves.
LD, go for launch.
Vent valves will be closed over the next few seconds to maintain that pressure in those tanks. We heard a final go from SpaceX launch control. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Engine start and liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, launching a new generation of broadband connectivity for the Starlink network. Falcon 9 has cleared the towers. Hope you enjoyed that natural sound from the rumble of the 9 Merlin 1D engines. It was quite a sound here locally at Kennedy Space Center. The Falcon 9 is now arcing to the southeast from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station out over the Atlantic Ocean, a minute 40 seconds into the flight. 9 Merlin engines continue firing. Two minutes, 8 seconds into the flight. Less than 30 seconds now from main engine cutoff and stage separation. Just a quick cut over to the onboard camera from SpaceX's onboard feed. Spectacular shot there. The SpaceX feed comes with a bit of a delay. Back live from our camera position at Kennedy Space Center. We've seen main engine cutoff now. Standing by for staging. And there's staging and ignition of the upper stage engine. The upper stage now firing its single Merlin vacuum engine. And the first stage making its way now back to the drone ship over parked northeast of the Bahamas. That first stage landing is expected at T plus 8 minutes 30 seconds, about 5.5 minutes from now. Still seeing some views of the Falcon 9 upper stage on its way into space. And now we're switching over to SpaceX on an onboard view showing the Starlink satellites standing by for payload fairing separation. And there's the jettison of the Falcon 9's payload fairing. This is a different view than we're accustomed to. This is a view from the top of the stack looking down. We usually see that payload fairing from an upward-facing or forward-facing camera. Spectacular shot as the Falcon 9 climbs into space right around sunset here in Florida. This SpaceX video comes with, again, a bit of a delay, about 15 seconds or so. So what you're seeing actually occurred about 15 seconds behind real time. 4 minutes since the launch. Everything looking good so far for Starlink 6-1. A downrange tracking station in Bermuda is now tracking, receiving signals from the Falcon 9 rocket. Now approaching 6 minutes into the flight, the next major milestone will be the restart of 3 of the booster engines. That's on the left-hand view of this split screen from SpaceX. That will be a braking maneuver or an entry burn to slow that rocket down as it dives into the atmosphere, heading for touchdown on the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas. And there is ignition of the entry burn. We saw that distinctive green flash from the TTAB ignition system, and now 3 engines firing. You see the velocity on the lower left decreasing rapidly with this braking maneuver.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
We've heard audio confirmation of entry burn shutdown. We expect to see that visually. And there is the visual confirmation of entry burn shutdown. About a minute
Stage 2 FTS
and 40 seconds remaining until landing of the first stage. Here's a map from SpaceX showing the locations of the upper stage and the first stage. First stage making its descent back into the atmosphere, heading for the drone ship northeast of the Bahamas. The second stage accelerating into orbit. Another minute or so left in that burn of the upper stage. Also about a minute left until landing of the first stage. Those 2 events will occur just a few
Loss of signal, Cape Canaveral.
Just a few moments apart. The Falcon 9 has now climbed or flown over
Stage 1 transonic.
the horizon as viewed from Cape Canaveral, so signals are no longer being received here at the spaceport, but a downrange tracking station in Bermuda is tracking the rocket at this point. About 45 seconds from landing now. You can see those clouds growing larger in the field of view as the booster makes its way to the drone ship. This is a football field-sized vessel that SpaceX uses to recover rockets and bring them back to port.
Stage 1 landing burn.
We've heard audio verbal confirmation of the landing burn, and now there we see it visually from the onboard camera view. The center engine of
Stage
the
1 landing leg
booster
display.
firing.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
And the stage 1 has landed. Booster 1076 making a twilight descent back to the drone ship northeast of the Bahamas, completing this booster's third trip to space. A beautiful shot of that booster sitting on the deck. And we just heard confirmation, and now we see it with a bit of a delay from the video feed of
Nominal parking orbit insertion.
SECO 1. That is second stage engine cutoff number 1. And we've also heard confirmation of a nominal parking orbit insertion. So far, so good. Everything has gone by the book for the first 9 minutes of this mission. The upper stage is safely in its preliminary orbit, but it has another burn to do in at about 45 minutes from now. It'll relight its single engine for just a couple of seconds, setting the stage for deployment of the 21 upgraded second-generation Starlink satellites about 1 hour, 4 minutes after liftoff.
Expected loss of signal Bermuda.
About 55 minutes from now. Great shot of the booster on the deck of the drone ship here. You can see one of the water cannons being activated, part of the standard post-landing safing procedure. So right now, the Falcon 9 upper stage and the 21 Starlink satellites are in a preliminary parking orbit around the Earth. This next burn, which is expected at T plus 54 minutes, will put the satellites into an orbit between 227 miles and 232 miles above the Earth. That's 365 kilometers by 373 kilometers at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. Again, the southeasterly track we saw for tonight's launch is necessary to reach this orbital inclination. And once the satellites are deployed from the Falcon 9 upper stage, they'll unfurl their solar arrays. This is a part test mission because this is the first launch of these upgraded model of version 2 mini satellites for the Starlink program. And SpaceX ground teams are eager to test out those systems on the satellites. They'll deploy 2 solar array wings. The original version of the Starlink satellites just had 1 solar array wing. That's one of several major differences between the older Starlink design and the new Starlink design. And then they'll use their argon-fueled thrusters instead of krypton-fueled thrusters. These are plasma engines that use a combination of an inert gas with the combination of electricity to accelerate those ions of the gas through a electrical connectivity, basically, to generate a small amount of thrust. These argon thrusters on the satellites just produce about 170 millinewtons of thrust. That's a very small number, about 0.04 pounds. That's roughly equivalent to the weight of a AA battery, just to give you some perspective on the very low thrust but very highly efficient performance of these new thrusters. Just to review the mission stats for tonight's flight, this was the 206th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket overall, the 216th flight overall for the entire Falcon rocket family, including Falcon 1, Falcon 9, and Falcon Heavy. This was the 3rd launch and landing for this particular booster. This was the 115th SpaceX launch from Pad 40. That's SpaceX's most often used launch pad. This is the 170th launch overall from this launch complex. And that includes Titan rockets that used to fly from this pad dating back to the 1960s. This was the 174th successful landing of a Falcon booster, including Falcon 9s and Falcon Heavies. This was the 74th SpaceX launch primarily dedicated to the Starlink network, the 13th SpaceX launch of the year, and the 10th launch from Cape Canaveral so far in 2023. Before we sign off our coverage, we want to look ahead at the upcoming launches we're going to be covering over the next few weeks. On February the 28th, that's just tomorrow, SpaceX has a Falcon 9 launch scheduled from out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. That's the Starlink 2-7 mission with 51 of the older version of the Starlink satellites on board. That launch had been scheduled for today, but SpaceX postponed it due to bad weather at the spaceport in California. The launch tomorrow, it does have some iffiness around it as well because of not only a bad weather forecast, but also there may be a decision from SpaceX to defer this launch in favor of proceeding with the Crew 6 launch first. That's the next launch on the schedule on Thursday morning from here at Kennedy Space Center. This mission, carrying a crew of 4 to the space station, was supposed to take off this morning at 1:45 a.m. Eastern Time, but was scrubbed just a couple of minutes before liftoff due to a ground system problem. If that problem is resolved, NASA and SpaceX want to get that mission off the ground on Thursday. And if they decide to proceed with that Thursday launch date, the SpaceX teams could elect to defer the Falcon 9 Starlink launch from California until later in the week. Here's a live view, by the way, of pad 39A, where the Falcon 9 rocket for Crew 6 remains vertical on the pad this evening, a little more than 16 hours or so since its scrubbed launch attempt very early this morning. The next try for this mission, the next opportunity for this mission to get off the ground is on Thursday morning at 12:34 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:34 UTC. When this launch happens, when the countdown is underway, we'll of course have live streaming coverage, just as we did very early this morning for this launch attempt on our YouTube channel. Looking ahead to next week, SpaceX has another Falcon 9 launch scheduled from Pad 40 on March the 9th. That's the next launch from Complex 40 after tonight's mission, carrying a batch of 40 OneWeb Internet satellites to orbit. Also next week, on March the 8th, no earlier than March the 8th, Relativity Space, a startup launch company, plans to fly their Terran 1 rocket for the first time. This is a test flight of Relativity's small to mid-class launch vehicle. There's no customer payload on this mission. Relativity Space calls it Good Luck, Have Fun, and we've put the acronym there, GLHF, for their code name or their nickname for this mission. That launch will originate from down at Launch Complex 16, a long disused launch pad on the old Missile Row area of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station that has been brought back into service by Relativity for their Terran 1 rocket. So that's a look ahead at the launch calendar over the next couple of weeks. We have 3 more SpaceX missions over the next couple of weeks, as well as the Relativity Space test flight on tap in early March. We're going to sign off from our dedicated commentary stream at this point. It's been 17 minutes since the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket on the Starlink 6-1 mission. While we're going to pause our commentary or end our commentary on this dedicated stream, we'll continue periodic updates over on our Launchpad Live channel, on our Launchpad live stream, and we'll have continuing updates during the upcoming burn of the second stage engine. That's a relight that's expected in about 37 minutes from now, and we'll have an update there as well. At the time of deployment of the 21 Starlink satellites, we expect to hear calls from SpaceX Launch Control during that event, but we're not going to get any live video from the rocket, so that's why we're going to end our stream here. But hop on over to Launchpad Live for continuing updates on Starlink 6-1 over the next hour or so. We'll have updates as well on spaceflightnow.com, as well as on our Spaceflight Now social media channels. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Thanks for joining us.